We are here and we are back for the July office hour. It's been a few months since we've been here. I'm glad to see all of you. We have Liz, Bennett, Julie, Elise, Lee, and Lynn here on the call. All of them writing novels. Yes, that's true. Uh, and so the thing that we want to talk about today is I'll just use you as an example, Liz. So, well, the interesting thing is that you wrote a big book that you then broke up into smaller books. You've published the first one, City of Sevens. Buy it now on Amazon. Link coming in the chat. Uh, you broke it up into shorter books. Did you break it up into two or three?
Two. And so like I know already like where the ending goes, but now, I'm gonna change it all, but where it
Yeah.
needs to go.
Yeah.
Um,
So the
yeah,
challenge so you've published book one successfully. You figured out a way to make a great ending for book one that reaches a climax and makes book one work like a book. Now part of the challenge is to publish book two and or write and revise to create book two. And the piece that we want to talk about is straddling that line between picking up where book one left off to satisfy and build on what the readers of book one want more of, and inevitably for building an author brand and building readers, book two has to come out as a new thing and a new entry point for the series. So you have to be able to create enough standalone content in book two right off the bat that it can work for someone who didn't read um, book one. And so if we look at Lee Child and Michael Connolly as successful example as writers who've done this successfully, the two templates are Reacher in the Lee Child books never changes, and every story is self-contained, like a 60-minute episode of an old TV show. I always think of the Incredible Hulk as an example for this with Bill Bixby. Like there's this intrigue concept that like at some point he'll find the scientists who got him to turn into the Hulk. Lou Ferrigno plug, love Lou Ferrigno as the Hulk. And at the end of every episode, he would be like leaving the town after hulking out, and like he would just be back on his own again with the torn clothes. Um, that's the Lee Child model. Like there's a fully contained story. Reacher leaves at the end of every book. And with Michael Connolly, the character gets older and he has life events. Like at some point, he has a daughter. At some point, Connolly had been writing the books for long enough that the character had to retire from the police force. So Connolly dealt with all of those, but those were all backdrop events in Bosch's life. And each story, each mystery was completely self-contained, beginning, middle, end. And there might be references to other ones, but it was never anything that you needed to understand what was going on. And your situation is different, Liz, because these were all initially one book. And so we can talk about that, and the more general concept would apply for what happens when you want to write book three.
well, I guess my question is like, I don't think I've ever read a sequel to a novel without having read the first one. I've never gone like, hey, here's a series with 12 books. Let me start at six. Like, I've never done that. I don't know anybody who would do that. I've read books that, like, you know, are those self-contained ones that don't need to be read in any order. Like, I used to read Cat Who mysteries. If you've ever read those don't need to ever be read in any sort of order. And so, I'm wondering like how much of this is really a concern because I feel like if there was a new book, I would start at the beginning anyway for a new author. I would
Yeah.
always go like, well, what's book one? I want to know what happened in that one before I'm going to launch into two or three.
Yeah, that's interesting. And both of the examples that I offer are from the mystery genre, where they're big, chunky books that come out in hardcover first and cost 25 bucks or something. I definitely see my daughter reading series. One of them has like a one thing that's books 1 through 4, and one of them has a thing that says books. Uh, yeah, and so then other ones are like, this is book 1, this is book 2, and so she does read them in order. So that's interesting. I think part of the premise of my curiosity about this is that I have looked at series books as ways to continue to grow audience. So like with the Jack Palms crime series, I always thought it was very easy for people to go back and access the earlier ones because they were completely available as free audio. And so anyone who wanted to listen could jump in. But so book 1 was totally self-contained. Book 2 wound up taking me longer to write than I wanted. So I broke it up into 2 different books. So book 3 wasn't entirely self-contained. Checkmate really depended on the first two. But when it came time to publish Checkmate as a book, I made a lot of changes to it to make it. Um, so Checkmate, yeah, what happened? So Jack Wakes Up and This Is Life, books 1 and 2, were both third person, all restricted to Jack's point of view. And then in book 3, I had already written Young Junius, which was a bunch of characters' points of view. And so book 3, Checkmate, had other characters' point of view, so we could get story when Jack wasn't on stage. And I really liked that. And then when it was time to publish This Is Life as a book for Thomas and Mercer, I had to take out all the other perspectives and points of view to make it into one book when I re-included Checkmate. But now Checkmate is published back in the original form where it's got the multiple points of view. So, yeah, I mean, I guess another example is the Magic Treehouse books, which have a ton of numbers, uh, and you can read them in any order.
I always use Harry Potter as an example
Right.
because there's a bunch of them, and I I've read them all before, and I've seen the movies and everything. And like stuff happens, say in book 1, that they reference in book 2. Like you kind of have to know who Voldemort is, and but they like because it's a children's book, they'll like kind of tell it over and over again a little
Yeah.
bit, and so it's
Yeah.
slightly different, but just from a storytelling perspective, the how it like continues and things build on each other. um it's kind of, you don't need to have read the beginning ones because they
Right.
catch you up
Right.
with like, what's the relevant information.
Yeah.
um and so I guess in my stuff I was thinking about it a little bit like that, where I would mention at the beginning, just here's the stuff that's going to be relevant for this story, even if it is um on you were talking about content versus context.
Yeah.
um even
Like
if
the
it is
context, just to define, like the context is the world building,
yeah.
the elements of this world, and then the content is the things that had happened.
Yeah, so I guess I was just like going to like quickly summarize some of the
Right.
content that had happened in book 1 that was relevant to just continue the story on. And what what do we do about that? Is that okay? And that type of thing. And I from Harry Potter, I was kind of just basing it on that.
Does she just summarize at the beginning?
Kind of, yeah. Like she'll start. They always start in the same place because it's kind of a
Right.
children's book, and they kind of like re-summarize the world, who
Mm.
Harry is, what's going on with his, aunt and uncle and cousin Dudley or whatever his name is. And kind of like he's a wizard who survived and has this scar on his forehead. So there's like certain information that happens at every book that gets sprinkled in that's relevant. Um,
Yeah.
and then mention some things like, what happened last time with the guy with the head that turned out to be in the back of his head, and that sort of thing. And the continue the story with the second. So
Yeah, I think that's a good format. I think that can work. And, part of this is about comes out of when we read your beginning of book two in workshop last time. And sometimes in workshop, to catch someone up to something in the middle of a novel, we'll put like a chunk in italics that says, this is the important information. This is what you need to know. I think obviously, the Harry Potter thing is more artfully done for readers than that. And so you want to definitely like scale it up from like what you would do for workshop. But I also think, Harry Potter is a good example. Um, but I think there's a way to also like we talk about not doing info dumps and not putting like a bunch of info all in one place. I think there's a way to weave in what the reader knows so that it comes across gradually. And part of it, what you need for that is to understand from readers, and beta readers are good for this, what the big questions are. So when I was reading your book, chapter three or something, and she goes back to the office and she's been out of the office for 3 weeks or a week, I think it's useful for you as a writer to know my question was, where was she or something like that, so that to put that into chapter three, or that that's a question for readers that you want to answer sooner so that they're I mean, it's all about satisfying the reader when they pick up book two. Maybe they read book one 2 years ago and they don't remember everything, but they still like you as an author. I mean, one of the few really proven viable ways to build a readership as a writer is to publish books regularly, consistently, and each time a book comes out, you get a promo boost, whether you're doing it yourself or Random House is doing it or whoever is doing it. There's just a way to create excitement around a release that you see in the movies or you see in books. I start talking about the release. Uh, Maybe you mention it to a friend, or it's like, oh, I went to this reading, something like that, where like we saw this with Ground, and each time we published one, it had there was some excitement around it, and then it would peter off pretty quickly. Ideally, like you build excitement and it kind of scales up, or it like maintains. Um, but it does inevitably with every new book, it peters out because there's always new stuff that's being promoted to readers for new things to buy so that the industry can make money. Right now I'm seeing that book, The Heat Will Kill You First, everywhere, fresh air, cover of the New York Times Book Review. And in 3 months, where will it be? Or I'll certainly not be seeing it as much in the same places. Yeah, Julie.
I had it was just a couple thoughts. Um, I think that Harry Potter is a good example from what I remember of Harry Potter. There weren't any everybody kind of read them in order, but that's in a way it's because they came out in order. I mean, this the young now kids have to choose where they're going to start, and but most of the time you'd start at the early ones with your young kids and read on up. Um, but it seems like if you've got two or three books that really go together, especially if you have three books really going together, you could call them a trilogy, and then the reader's going to start with number one no matter what, because they don't want to be lost in numbers two and numbers three. But if you're not calling it a trilogy and you've got three that are interconnected, I was thinking about this with yours last time, Liz. It's really hard not to give away, some of the major plot points and uh, crisis points, and even what happens in book two, because the reader sort of needs to know what happened in book one. And I don't know if I have any good suggestions about how to do that, but I've been thinking about that when in reading other books, series of books, and there's so many mystery stories that are written in series, and I have started in the middle a lot of times and then kind of, oh, I like this author. I'll just kind of go back to number one and read my way up. Um, and, sometimes and I've been starting to notice how, or trying to notice how they do that, how they don't give away the conclusion of the last one while still allowing the characters to grow and become more in depth and they have families or their families or get old or whatever they do. And it's interesting, but mostly I think they keep the stories pretty much separated, like Connolly does and Lee Child does. That the story number two doesn't depend on what happened in story number one.
Mhm.
And
That's the challenge, I think, that I'm trying to articulate is that you don't want any spoilers. You don't want to say like, oh, this character died at the end of book two, at the end of book one. Uh, and you don't want any gaping holes so that someone who just picked the book up gets really confused and doesn't understand what's going on.
I mean, two things occur to me. One is that there's series that where the storyline doesn't follow through, the characters continue book to book, like the
Yeah.
Reacher series. He gets off the bus in a different place every time. The only thing that is contiguous in the sense of maintaining the story forward is the guy himself, is the
Yeah.
character. Then there's books where the storyline actually proceeds, like the Harry Potters, where the storyline proceeds from book to book. And I think that's a different kind of problem. Um,
But it
and I
sounds
don't,
like in the Harry Potter books, from what Liz is saying, that they do stand alone. They do have the tools for a reader to pick up each one and be okay with it.
Yeah,
Or,
but like, so Harry
because they
Potter,
are so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, but like, so for Harry Potter, like, I'd have to go back and look at it, but like, I'm pretty sure Dumbledore dying is a plot point in the later ones. And so, like, even if you started at the later ones, you would know, and those would be big spoilers, like, he eventually dies, you know?
but he's like a super old character who's probably going to die at some point anyway. It's not like, oh
No,
my
he's
God, he
like
got killed in the big
100
battle.
years old. Like, he's a wizard. He's like, who knows when he was supposed to die?
Then you've just ruined the Harry Potter series for me.
I'm like 25 years old. I'm pretty sure I can ruin it.
So what?
I think there's another. Am I on mute? No.
Nope.
Okay. um, there can be these standalone, like Connolly. Everyone is a standalone. The major plot is standalone, but the subplot, which is more personal, can develop from book to book. And so it's more like the backstory continues, not the major plot line continues. And lots of times I think that subplot that is more personal is what keeps people going. But it gives the reader the satisfaction of each novel ending. And Patricia Cornwell does that a bit with her books. There is a backstory with her character and her love interest that develops across the series, but each book is a standalone. And it makes the reader, that subplot, knowing that it continues to develop, I think draws the reader in.
I think what you're trying to do, Liz, is have the characters and stuff continue to evolve. And book one had a beginning, middle, end. Book two, as we started it, is already starting to have its own issues and its own questions about who Nadia is going to become or what her challenges are. So you want to have a beginning, middle, end there. And so I think the big question is like managing the flow of information. Sometimes you can put in information and it's more than necessary. So like if Nadia comes, but you'd like this plot point where Nadia comes back and there's a celebration. So she's been out for a week. Maybe you need to just put in something that says where she was or why she was out so that you close that loop, but you can still it still looks like you're going to have a new arc for this story.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess my problem is that my plot storyline here does hinge on the previous book. Something that happened there affects the inciting incident in this book. And
Yeah,
so that's
but
my issue, I guess, that I need to figure out.
but I think you're already handling that. Like you're talking about her letting the guy in to take the thing out of the vault.
Yeah.
So I think that you're already handling. Like she has a conversation with Anthony, is that his name?
Thomas?
Thomas. She has a conversation with Thomas in chapter 2 about the fact that she gave him this thing. So the reader knows that she gave him this thing. We don't know how that unlocked or like changed everything at the end of book 1, so that's good. But we already know from chapter 2 enough for chapter 4 when Rune tells her like I want you to find out who infiltrated this thing. So you're already building that up without us having to know book 1. So as that's the main intrigue point, I think you've already done what you need to do there. And so it's other stuff that's like, yeah, you're building world at the beginning of book 2, good. And there's this classic New York Times essay by Lee Child that's about like understanding which circles you open with the reader and which chapters. And some of the circles take multiple chapters to close, and some of the circles get opened in a chapter and closed in the chapter. And so it's just a point of recognizing in each chapter what circles did you open and what's your plan for them. And it felt to me like to in that chapter where she comes back to work, there's certain things that I'm being told this something happened this week that's different that you missed. And I think you could just put in a piece of dialogue or something like that that closes that circle in that chapter. And the challenge is being aware of those as you go. But I think you can do it.
Yeah. The other thing that I'm struggling with as I like try to think about the arc of the storyline is that like the main arc ends up kind of like getting resolved, but then I pick up another one that ends up carrying it to the end.
Yeah.
And it's like, is that okay? Can I do that? If it's like kind of instead of the whole
Yeah. I think that's cool because sometimes what happens with a book is, uh, if I start reading a book and there's a challenge in the first couple of chapters, then I think, oh, like a classic example is Red Harvest by Dashiell Hammett. Like he goes to this place to solve this murder, and you think like, oh, he's gonna like this whole thing is gonna be about him solving the murder. But then he solves the murder in chapter 6 or something like that. And then at that point, it's like, oh my God, what's the rest of the book going to be? So it actually works really well to make a big intrigue. And then he decides that he's going to clean up the whole town. And the rest of the book is just this crazy bloodbath, which is why they call it Red Harvest. And it's awesome. So I guess, yeah, you can do that, but it needs to feel like the thing that you close in the middle or early on isn't as big as the next thing that comes.
Yeah. Okay.
The next climax needs to be bigger. But I like that. I mean, I think that's really fun in any book when you're reading and you get to that point where, like, I really don't know what's going to happen next. So, in your book, when she starts to have this internal conflict about whether she's going to out herself or how she's going to manage her relationship with Rune as her mentor and try to solve this crime where she's kind of the culprit, uh, is really challenging. And I want to see how that will play out. So I'll keep reading. But then if something happens to like resolve that in chapter 10, and I see that there's 10 more or 20 more chapters, then you've hooked me. And I really want to know what happens.
Okay, good. Because that's what I'm doing.
Good. Yeah, Red Harvest is a great example for that.
So just speaking to the practicals of it, because this is where I got hung with Elizabeth's story. I couldn't find a description of the main character. I just didn't know what she looked like. I had some idea what the characters you were introducing looked like, but I had no idea what it was the clue that I should have caught, that when I should have realized it was not the first book. That should have given it away to me, but it didn't. I just didn't catch it. When I realized it was the second book, I understood why those funny little holes that were sort of catching me up were there. So I think that if you recognize what you need to do, just in case it's the first thing that people pick up, that you don't lose track of the kind of information people need in order to be in the story properly, no matter where the long version of the story is going. At least for that scene in that day, people know where they are. There's a floor under their feet. They can, the story makes sense to them. Yeah. And I think that if you just sort of do a short list of what you need in order for that to be taken care of, then you can go anywhere you want with the rest of the story. People are going to be carried by the quality of the writing and the interesting thing that you're doing.
I think the question of the character's appearance is really dependent on two things. What's the point of view? If it's first person, the character isn't going to spend a lot of time thinking about what they look like. So we're in the character's head and we just roll with it. I think a lot of first person books don't give a big description of the character, and that's fine because we just imagine ourselves or someone that we know in those shoes. And yours is like a close third person, right, Liz?
Yeah, it's close third. And so I always struggle with like how to do it unless she's like looking in a mirror, I like, don't really, which I always like fall back on.
So in Jack Wakes Up, the first book, I thought I needed to do that. So I had him look in the mirror and like adjust his hat or something. But I never did that in any other books and no one ever complained. I think it's something that might come up in workshop, but I think as readers, we're really used to just filling in our own imagination. Like people read the Jack Palms books and then they meet me and they're like, "You're Jack Palms," or something like that. But like I always read, I think, I don't know, for me, like with male characters, uh, I come up with an idea of what the character looks like, and I just make it up based around like something like me. Like, I'm tall. I read the Michael Connelly books. Uh, the Reacher books specifically say that he's tall, so everyone wants Reacher to be tall. And then Tom Cruise played Reacher, and everyone's upset that Tom Cruise is too short. Now they have some Hulk dude playing him on the Amazon series, and he's like way more muscular than Reacher should be, and he's tall. But Jack Lee Child is also pretty tall himself, but he's skinny, so I picture Reacher as skinny. But I remember, yeah, so I had that challenge around Bosch. Oh, right. Tom Cruise played Reacher, sorry. But this other guy plays Bosch on the Amazon series. And I was talking to Michael Connelly about it at a conference. And I said, I really like the Bosch show, but I don't like that guy, Titus Welliver. I don't see him as Bosch because he seems too short to me. And Connelly was like, actually, I chose him because I thought he was perfect for Bosch, and I really love him as an actor. And I was like, oh, sorry. But, I think I always picture characters that I really like as having some of my characteristics. I don't remember Bosch ever being described in a book. And I remember one of my mentors and favorite authors when I was writing short stories was Chris Offutt. And I had read all of his short stories. And so I just imagined him as the main character, but I also was using like a lot of my, it's the co-creation piece where it's like some of it is my experience and some of it is this character that I imagine. And then I met Chris Offutt and I was like, I can't believe how short you are. I just imagined that he was really tall. So
I
I think,
remember when my daughter was in sixth grade or seventh grade, and she had to write a book report on a book that she'd read. So she read the book, and she goes and she gets her report back, and and she got points knocked off for not describing the main character. And she said, Mom, I went through the book. The main character is not described in the book anywhere.
Yeah.
She's just a girl. And and
Well,
I said, oh, and I said, I don't remember that. I have this vivid picture. I read the book when I was a kid. I have a vivid picture of what this girl looks like. I went back and looked through the book again, and she was absolutely right. Never is the color of her hair. Does she wear it in pigtails? Whatever. Nothing.
I
Doesn't, you
think
don't know
as a
what
kid,
I said,
whenever
the kid is entirely free to make it up, which I think is perfect.
yeah, as a kid, whenever I read a book, I would make up what the character looked like based on the cover. And now that I know more about publishing, I know that the whole book is created before the cover is created. And the artist who does the cover mostly hasn't read the book. So they just make something up. But I also think, like, going back to the point of view thing, if we're in first person point of view or close third, the important thing to remember is that we're seeing the whole world through that character's eyes. And, if I'm not looking at a mirror, I go through every day of my life not really thinking about what my face looks like or not seeing my face, except when I'm doing Zoom, I see it. But I think it's important to have body characteristics and a sense about body language and, like, if it's a tall character, maybe the person has to squeeze to go under a doorway or something like that. Like that kind of stuff really plays in and helps. Or a character is like looking down at another or looking up at another or crossing their legs. Like the body is important, and I see my body all day, every day. So that needs to come into the narrative. But I don't think like exquisite or specific facial characteristics are really important.
So back to the standalone versus series. I'm in a mystery book club, a dozen ladies, all over 65, who have read every mystery ever written.
Mine? Then, have they read all my books?
Yeah, well, I've suggested yours, maybe next year. It's a little rough for the old ladies, but maybe. But the point is, nobody does. We read mysteries. So many of them are series. Some of them, the author has clearly decided, screw you. If you want to understand book 3, go back to book 1. I'm not going to make book 3 completely standalone. And it seems that the trade-off is either you bore your reader by repeating all of those things that made the first book a hit. Let's say setting was a big feature in the first book. The reader who's been with you for the first 2 books does not want to hear the setting described in such magical terms a third time. So you bore them. Or you're a new reader and you're looking for a true standalone, and it isn't there, and so you're confused. So it's a trade-off between confusing the reader and boring the reader when you write a series.
That's the line that I think you need to straddle. And so we've talked about straddling the line where they get the right amount of information. The additional point that you bring up is giving the reader too much information and boring them. So we want to, it feels like a thin line, but there's also a bandwidth, like you don't want to go overboard in either direction. So it's a challenge.
And
it's not only just not having spoilers, like the context piece, like the world building. You don't want to repeat too much of that. And I thought you did a good job with that, Liz.
Thanks. Well, that's one thing too, like, it's the same setting. A lot of it is the same setting, but I get bored with the same setting. So I'm like looking for like, what other new rooms can I explore at this headquarters? Yeah. And so I keep it fresh for me so I can discover, new secrets and new whatever. But I still probably do need to give like a passing glance over the description of places that were in the first one.
But in terms of, you don't need to recreate San Francisco. Like you just have a few key phrases like Silicon Valley or startups or whatever, and that works. And if people don't know San Francisco, the specifics of it are part of what makes the book interesting. like having that specific texture and reality that only someone who lives there can know or has visited there. And people can go visit San Francisco and want to go visit because they read like someone went to the Hogwarts place that Lynn has in the back of her background, and people like it to go see because it's like Harry Potter. So it's like it gives people reasons to want to go places.
Yeah, I mean, like I literally went to Cornwall because of Poldark. So, setting is a big thing.
Were you going to say something more a minute ago, Bennett?
No, it's just that I'm really interested in this because I still toy with the idea of finally picking from among my characters and putting together a team that goes forward with maybe some series. And I think it's exceedingly difficult to keep each new novel truly standalone unless you are willing to do a lot of repetition. I mean, there's a reason why your first book is a hit. Either it was the character you developed, and in many books, a lot of character development comes early in the book, and then you ride with that through the reader now has got it and understands the character, and you can say less about his character as you go forward. But if you're going to do a standalone, you almost have to start over again in the next book to reestablish the reader's understanding of this rich character. And that's where I think the reader has a risk of getting bored. And if you just plunge ahead and say, screw it, read my first book, then the reader who comes to book 2 de novo is hopelessly confused. So it's a really challenging concept to say, I want to write a great first book, but I want to continue it as a series. That's not easy to do.
But I do think that there is a way to do it and grow the readership with each book. Like with every book of yours that a reader picks up, 100% of them are not going to go read another book by you. That's the reality. And so if you're concerned about building a writing career, one of the trends that I see when I talk to people at conferences is there's a real pattern where like everyone has a certain amount of success with book 1 and all the books after that do successively less well. And if you look at any writer who's had big success, when you're talking about people who don't care, for some reason, Neal Stephenson comes up to me. Like he's had crazy success and he can do whatever he wants. It's that theory of like, you don't have to care about your batting average or if you're swinging for home runs or trying to bunt in a weird situation if you're already up 20 runs. Like he's not worried about losing readers. But, for every writer that's been successful, like their first book had some level of success, and then they found ways with other books to continue to draw in new readers. You're always going to lose readers when they pick up a book. Like you're never going to have 100% return. But the only way to grow a career is to grow your reader numbers. And so there's got to be a way when each new book comes out that you can offer that to people who've never read you before and have them go get the new Liz Coleman release and not have to go buy book 1 too.
Well, so one thought I had too, which is trickier about my second book, is that I'm literally picking it up a week after the events.
Yeah.
Most sequels, like maybe some time has passed. I don't have to like talk about what's going on in the first one because life has moved on. They're kind of slightly different people now, or like whatever. And I'm picking it up right after because that's how I wrote it. I've thought about like changing, but it would like change everything and it would be a mess. And I don't know what I would even do. Because I set all these things in motion in the first one that I want to resolve.
Well, the thing that you put in about her stealing the thing out of the vault for Thomas is intriguing and makes me want to read more of book 2. It also makes me want to read book 1, but it doesn't make me feel like I have to have read book 1 to read book 2. When she comes back to the office and everyone's celebrating because it's a big return, I just get confused of where she was that last week. If you change that so they didn't have a big celebration, it would just be more smooth. Like, oh, Nadia's back. Like she's back in the office. She was away. Not everyone knew it. She doesn't
Yeah.
even have to have been away.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I'll end up doing. Like right now, I'm just trying to get like the bones in the right order to like make this thing go. But I'm not like precious about like that scene has to happen or something. Like I'm just that was my draft of like get her back in the office. What happens? You know,
Yeah,
how
like
do
if
I
she
work
goes
on it?
back to the office a week later,
And
maybe she
nothing
took a
does.
couple sick days, maybe she didn't. The
Yeah.
thing that's important is that she gets called into Rune's office, the mentorship thing comes up, and he puts her on this new project that really creates a conflict for her. I see the office piece and her coming back as like more world building of like introducing the office and all these different kinds of characters. You don't need to do that all at once. Like
Yeah.
she can sit down at her desk and the person at the next desk is a fairy. And then when she's walking to Rune's office, she gives a high five to a guy that's a hippopotamus. I don't know. But like these things can come in gradually. It doesn't have to be set up all at once at the beginning. Maybe that comes from you using the Harry Potter template, but you don't, in this case, I think that doesn't work for you.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And, you know, this draft that I'm working on right now is just like get all the pieces there. And then I'm going to look at the pacing, look at what's going on, what information is missing. Is this scene
Mhm.
working? Is it too long? Is this section just need to be cut? And I have like really like amazing scenes that I don't want to cut, but like
Yeah.
if they're bloating it, like I'm just gonna have to cut it because it's not serving it. And you know, I'm accepting that. I'm gonna kill my darlings. But I'm
Good.
already like mentally prepared for streamlining and cutting things out
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
So
So I've been learning a new tool from the Author Accelerator program. It's called the Inside Outline, and it's kind of a cross between an outline and a scenario that we did. And it's making me come around to some idea. You know, there's this idea of plotters and pantsers, and they both have their benefits. So it makes sense that some kind of hybrid in the middle, like these are the ends of the spectrum, get somewhere in between. There's got to be some benefit to not only pantsing. Did you hear I said that, Bennett?
I did.
Can you believe it? So, yeah, there's a new
I've
tool.
always believed in the compromise.
Yeah, I think it makes
You
sense
have to
to,
do both,
you have to, yeah,
especially with a mystery.
yeah. So I have some new thoughts on that and a new tool called the Inside Outline. I can talk about that more in an office hour at a later date. But yeah, I'd love to talk to you about it, Liz, when we meet next week. Uh,
Can I say
Lynn,
one last thing about Liz's book?
yeah, yeah,
I
that it's
think
great.
when you talk about standalones in a series, the Jack Reacher series, each story is a different story,
Right.
basically. And the only real continuing element that you have to reestablish is
Right.
Jack Reacher's character, which takes about 3 paragraphs. You know, he goes in and throws away his old set of clothes, and he tells someone he was an ex military cop, and you're back with Reacher. But in Liz's case, this is not a new adventure in the series. It's a continuation, a sequel. And I think that has its own challenges for making it a standalone that are much greater than Lee Child has when he plunks Jack Reacher down in a new story.
Yeah, it has its challenges, but I also think it really has its advantages. I mean, there's a reason why I mean, for me, the reason that I love shows like The Sopranos and The Wire and Breaking Bad is they build this contextual element over episodes and episodes and over seasons. The reason why I think Breaking Bad is a better show than The Wire is because Breaking Bad, every series is building a bigger climax, and every series works on its own. Every season works on its own, and every episode hopefully works on its own. So this is part of, if you look at TV, there's a parallel here. But I think Liz doing a sequel that builds on book one makes book two and the whole series be even better. And if you look at TV, that's the direction we've gone. Like I wouldn't go back and watch those Hulk TV shows because there's something less satisfying about seeing the whole thing wrapped up every week in 60 minutes than like coming back next week and like waiting to see what's going to happen. You know, it's the whole art of the cliffhanger or like gradual intrigue. And so, um, yeah, there's different challenges to that, but I think there's also bigger benefits.
Do you think you
I
could come into an individual um, episode in the middle of Breaking Bad and understand it as a standalone?
I think probably for
Ever
some
having seen another one?
I think probably for some episodes you could and some episodes you couldn't.
Yeah, really tough.
But I do think that like I mean, but you look at any show like that, um, any show like that that's successful was way bigger and more popular at the end of the run than it was at the beginning. So you can't just lose who you had at the beginning. And part of the thing is like if I start watching season 4 of The Sopranos and I'm loving it, I might tell you like, "Oh my God, I'm loving The Sopranos. You got to go check it out." And then they might start at season 1 or they might start at season 4. I don't think you could. I think the thing with a show like that is you can't get everything out of an episode that I might get if I've watched everything up to that, but it's got to
Right.
be good enough. Any given episode that you flick to, it's got to be good enough to catch your attention and you enjoy it enough to want to watch other episodes.
This is what I was saying at our workshop, that I think that's true enough that it's okay sometimes for the reader not to get everything and still enjoy it. Because I've had friends say, "Oh, you've got to watch this,"
Yeah.
and I sit down and I am so totally confused, I never go back. And then there are others where I'm kind of confused, but the story itself in that episode is fascinating and carries me along through the
Mhm.
confusion.
there's
It's po-
there's a good I think comparable to what Liz is trying to do, where it's two books, it's a series, and the story continues. And I don't know if you've read Chris Pavone, The Expats and the Paris Diversion, but they are two. It's a series. There's only two, and they definitely build on each other. And I just reread the Paris Diversion for other reasons. And I was going to go back, and that's the second one. I was going to go back and read the first one, but then I realized I already know what happened in the first one because I read the second one. So I think it goes back to the point that Bennett's making about there is this trade-off. So are you going to have a series where there's 20 of these books? That's a different issue than if there's two. If there's two, it might just be that they need to be read in order.
So yeah, that might be. I think what I would say is, did you want to say something, Liz, before we wrap up? So I would just say, like, we've established that it's tricky. We've established that you can go too far in one direction or too far in another. I also think it's a fact that, like, a book, any book after the first one needs to be good enough for readers to want to stick with it. And maybe Bennett and I disagree with what good enough looks like in the case of Liz's book. And it's possible that Liz's book is good enough in the first draft that she's already done. I hear Liz wanting to make it better, and so I'm offering suggestions on how to do that. But I mean, we all have to struggle as writers with figuring out, is this draft good enough? First draft, maybe it's good enough. 15th draft, maybe it's good enough. Maybe the 7th draft was good enough and you got to 15 and you were perfectionism, perfectionisting ism. Uh, but yeah, I think, this conversation shows the challenges, but I also think there are great benefits to doing a series book. And I like books like that more than I like the kind of like I've read a couple of Reachers and liked them, but I'm not compelled to read all of them because I get it. Like I know how it's going to go. He's going to kick some butt. The mystery is kind of intriguing, but I'm not hoping to read the next one to find out the answer to anything. And so,
Yeah, well, I think then, you really have to kind of know what you're trying to do. Are you making those standalone
right.
ones where the characters still continue, but the story is totally self-contained?
Yeah.
Or I think there's like Sigma Force. I don't know if you guys have ever read the Sigma Force
Yeah.
novels. Yeah, okay. So those ones are like totally self-contained, but the same characters. Or are you doing something where like Outlander? I've read all of the Outlanders. Those build on each other, and you definitely like you don't need to have read, but you'll like everybody goes back to the beginning and reads it because they love the characters and they want to see how they developed. So,
And some people just read a book by a certain author and then decide I'm going to read everything that this author has written, or I'm going to read their next book when it comes out. And that's how Lee Child did it. But yeah, from the beginning, he and Michael Connelly were both aware, like Michael Connelly, I'm going to make my character get older from book to book. And Lee Child started his series knowing that Michael Connelly was doing that and wanting to do it a different way. So yeah, you need to be conscious of it from the beginning. Uh, we need to wrap up for today for July. Thank you guys for being here and for the great discussion. I would be happy to talk to any of you about working on the novel that you have or planning the next book in progress. Liz and I are going to talk. Elise and Lynn, you guys are ready to start something new. Let's talk about it. And Bennett, maybe it's time for us to talk about what your new project looks like and how to outline it. Lee and Julie were in touch. Everyone, thanks for being here. Appreciate it. And we'll see you soon.